While we're waiting for people to log in, I'll just mention that this is part of an ad hoc series of seminars that we give as the Oxford University Biodiversity Network, which is a network that tries to connect all nature biodiversity related research across the university, and also to colleagues and partners working with us. And Carlin, perhaps you can pop the email and the website into the chat there. So if any of you want to join onto our mailing list, whatever department you're in, whatever your interest is, or if you're outside the university as well, do just sign up for the mailing list. And our information is also on the website. That'll be in the link. Okay, we'll start in about 1 minute, I think. Just going to give it another minute. Okay, I think we'll kick off now. I'm Yavinder Mali. I'm a coordinator of the Oxford University Biodiversity Network, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce our seminar for today and our speaker, Professor Amy Bogaard, who is Professor of Neolithic and Bronze Age Archaeology in the School of Archaeology here in Oxford. And just before she starts, it's wonderful to see the stimulation of conversations and discussions across different university departments. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Amy's perspectives on land use in Western Europe and more locally as well. So over to you, Amy.
Thanks so much for that kind invitation to join this seminar series today, and also to Carlin. I'm delighted to be here and to take the opportunity to share, as Yavinder has said, an archaeological perspective on biodiversity. And I'll particularly be interested in how this pertains to farming and to crops. And to do this, I'll present two topics that illustrate, I hope, some of the potential of archaeology, or bioarchaeology, which simply means the study of organic remains in archaeological sites and sequences, for exploring agrobiodiversity over the very long term. And my first topic will be early agrobiodiversity and lost crops. And secondly, I will look at long-term arable land use patterns, including with implications for the loss of agrobiodiversity. So my very broad focus in the initial part of this lecture is Western Asia, and a remarkable sequence of developments that take place here in the early Holocene. These maps encompass the wider region, and what is immediately obvious is its topographical and vegetational diversity. Now, I imagine that many in the audience will have heard of the term fertile crescent, and I thought I would pause and talk a little bit about that, because concepts around this have changed over time. The original concept of a fertile crescent as a cradle of agriculture and civilization referred to the Arc of Mesopotamia, so the area encompassed by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and the Nile Valley. But by the mid-20th century, research into the wild progenitors, the wild ancestors of early crops and livestock in the region, refocused attention on the zone of rain-fed farming to the north, in the so-called hilly flanks area, coinciding with the forested zones from the Levant up along the Anti-Taurus Mountains and down along the Zagros Mountains of Iraq and Western Iran. The open mixed oak deciduous woodland that describes the arc of the Fertile Crescent is the natural home of the large-seeded annual grasses and legumes that are central to the early agricultural story in Western Asia. And recent botanical surveys of wild cereal habitats in this region, and specifically in the Levant, illustrates that while the large-seeded wild cereal progenitors, such as wild emmer and wild barley, dominate these natural stands, these grasslands also contain a diversity of other species, including what we would now call arable weeds. So this is partly where weeds actually come from. And some of the people pictured here are Dr. Alex Weide in the central part of the lower photographs, who led this research, and Dr. Jade Whitlam in the lower left, both postdoctoral researchers in the School of Archaeology. So it seems that early forms of management of these annual habitats, stretching back into the late Pleistocene, involved protecting these stands as something like natural larders. And we've reported on some of this research in this publication. So this long-term management and exploitation of these annual grasses changes gear when we get to the early Holocene. And what I'm showing you here is a timeline and 3 graphs that are summarizing how busy the archaeological landscape of different parts of Western Asia is through time. And at about 12,000 calibrated before present, so that's about 10,000 BC, this is when we're transitioning from the late Pleistocene to the early Holocene. And what accelerated under the warmer and more stable climate conditions of the early Holocene was a consistent multi-regional trend of human population growth. And that's being estimated in these graphs here on the basis of radiocarbon dates for these 3 regions through time. So essentially, we're just seeing more people doing more in the landscape as we hit the early Holocene. And this is taken broadly as an indicator of demographic growth. This demographic growth fueled greater human intervention and labor input into plant cultivation, coinciding also with the capture and penning of animals to ensure local meat supply, and the architectural emergence of the self-contained modular household unit with its own internal cooking and storage facilities. And you can see some examples reconstructed in the upper left and upper right of the slide here. So a current hypothesis is that it was greater human labor investment in cultivation and herding that prompted notions of ownership and private property that were invested in these co-residential household units. And we're looking at examples here, that is reconstructions and then photographs of actual archaeological remains from the northern and southern Levant. And these date to the earlier 8th millennium BC. So we're now in the early 7000s BC. This map is now a snapshot of regional mixed farming systems as they appear on current evidence around 7500 BC. Apologies for some of the abbreviations here. This is a bit of a work in progress. But the point I'm trying to make is that at this point in time, in the mid 8th millennium BC, we are seeing consistently mixed farming systems emerge in different regions of Western Asia. That is mixed in the sense of combining cultivation and herding, but there are slightly different sets of crops and different emphases in terms of early animal husbandry in each of these regions. So there is no single farming package or a single magic formula. In fact, these are quite regionalized developments, but they are consistently combining cultivation and herding. Now, one of the best regions for tracking this process in situ is actually Central Anatolia, the southern part of the Central Anatolian Plateau, and in particular, the Cappadocian tell site of Aşıklıhöyük, which I'm briefly going to talk about. But before I leave this slide, I want to point out this inset map in the lower right, because this is a further update on the concept of the Fertile Crescent. So ongoing archaeological research has really shown that the southern part of the central Anatolian plateau is very much involved in these early agricultural developments, and in this author's representation is actually encompassed within the Fertile Crescent. So let's zoom in now to this site in Cappadocia. This is a settlement mound. You can see the dates here, so it spans a remarkable 1,000 years of continuous occupation. And at this particular site, what is very clear is that we have evidence for cultivation of crops. We have ongoing morphological domestication of those crops. So there's a mixture actually of shattering and, that is, wild and domestic forms through this period. And that cultivation and ongoing morphological domestication coincide with early experiments in sheep raising. So there's evidence for sheep penning, and the local evolution of households into rectilinear units that you can see packed densely together in the archaeological plan in the upper right-hand part of the slide that I'm gesturing to here. So this is part of this evolution of the modular rectilinear, that is architecturally rectilinear unit that is fitting together in the mosaic of these new farming communities that are emerging. And I'm delighted to say that part of this is based on the doctoral work of another postdoctoral researcher now in our school, Dr. Müge Ergun. This is another set of results from the same site, Aşıklıhöyük, but this is showing an amazing kind of stop motion sequence for the gradual introduction of sheep herding and the replacement of various forms of hunting as a source of meat through time. Now, subsequent in the regional Neolithic sequence of this region of Anatolia is Çatalhöyük, and this is now located further to the west. So you can see this, hopefully you can see my cursor in the upper left-hand map. This is now in the Konya Plain, a former Pleistocene lake basin of the southern part of central Anatolia. And here I'm going to focus on Çatalhöyük to illustrate for you the high agrobiodiversity of early established farming, including crops that subsequently become lost. So we're looking at another very long time period of occupation here, some 1,500 years. So that's equivalent to the time between now and the end of the Roman Empire. So this is serious sustainability and resilience over an incredibly long time span. This is actually a double mound site. So if you look in the lower right-hand corner, there is an east mound, that's the focus of the Neolithic occupation. There is also a west mound across the river channel as it exists in highly canalized form today that forms this continuous sequence over 1,500 years. There was a large international excavation project here from 1994 to 2017, so 25 years of systematic sampling of this Neolithic sequence under excavation so that we could recover this evidence for farming development. And here I wanted to give you an idea of what the direct evidence for ancient farming actually looks like. These are charred or carbonized plant remains. So they've been subjected to temperatures around 200 to 250 degrees Celsius, sometimes in the destruction of houses, sometimes in small domestic fires, so hearths or ovens. And that toasting at a relatively low temperature, so it's not reducing material to ash, it's actually preserving its morphology and to a great extent its biomolecular composition as well. So this is what enables us to then identify morphologically this whole range of plants that are being used by this early farming community. So the upshot of 25 years of work on this assemblage and over 10,000 samples having been taken is that we're looking over this 1,500-year period at consistent routine use of over 20 food plants. So one of the myths that this is busting is that agriculture somehow leads automatically to a narrowing of focus. In fact, it is just added to what was already a very diverse spectrum of foraging. And we've actually, I thought it might amuse some people in the audience who are ecologists, that we have used the concept of panarchy from ecology to frame a process in which individual households, that is individual co-residential units within this dense occupation, this dense village, are experimenting with different crops and contributing to collective resilience. So rather than everyone actually doing exactly the same thing with food plants, what we actually find is that different households, these are ones that have burned down that you can see in light gray in the architectural plan in the lower left-hand part of the slide, each of them are working with slightly different sets of crops and other food plants, but of course teaching each other what they're learning about the usefulness of these different species. Now, coming back to this diverse spectrum overall, there are a couple of species that I want to highlight and that I'm going to kind of pursue in the development of the story. So one of these is something called flicksweed. I don't know if there's anyone here in the audience from East Anglia, but that's one of the places in Britain, that more continental part of Britain where it still grows. The Latin name is Descarania sophia. It's an annual crucifer, so member of the Brassicaceae, and it is a source of oil. And what happened here at Çatalhöyük is that they didn't yet have a crop that provided oil in the diet. So they recruited something from the local arable weed flora. And remarkably, Descarania still grows in profusion in the region today. So this is an example of an early farming community creatively recruiting plants into the system. In this case, a plant with a weedy habit that would have been opportunistically jumping into arable fields in any case, and they use it to plug a gap in the crop spectrum. And we have pretty remarkable evidence for people's labor investment in collecting this plant. This is on the left, that's a photograph of a solid mass of these seeds, over 30 liters, that were packed into a little clay bin. I don't know if you can see this red arrow, but this is one of the bins in the side room, the storage room of a house that had burned down. You can see the pattern of burning. And it contained gazillions of these tiny seeded Descarania seeds, so a tiny seeded form of wild mustard. So I'm not talking about just casual interest in these plants. They're treating it as one of the staple plants that they then store on a significant scale. So in fact, Descarania sophia, that cruciferous species, is one of the reasons that the plant food spectrum actually doesn't narrow with domestication, contrary to, I think, popular belief. And so what is sometimes called the broad spectrum revolution, which supposedly precedes agriculture, actually continues with the emergence of farming itself. Now, also illustrative of the early agrobiodiversity of Çatalhöyük is another plant that I wanted to highlight. If you can see my red rectangle in the upper right-hand corner, this is a now obscure form of wheat called Timopheev's wheat, or Triticum timopheevii. And just to remind those of you who don't necessarily have a mental map of how all the different wheats are related to each other, timopheevii arises from Triticum aroraticum. That's a wild annual, very similar to Triticum dicocoides, to wild emmer, but representing a separate taxon, a separate domestication. Now, the morphological attribution of this material that we thought did resemble Timopheev's wheat as actually belonging to the Timopheevii group has now been confirmed through ancient DNA and recovery of the G genome that is distinctive of that group of wheats. This distinctive hulled wheat type is found in pure deposits at Çatalhöyük through the Neolithic sequence, and around the midway point of the Neolithic occupation, it largely replaces emmer wheat. So there's a lot of dynamism and a lot of trying out of new crops in these early days of farming. And this archaeological research is also feeding into mapping of the genetic diversity of this neglected gene pool and its potential for wheat improvement. And this paper is an example of that ongoing collaboration. Well, so far we've talked about how archaeobotanical research is recovering evidence of lost crops from the early days of farming, and how modern genetic research into wheat improvement can benefit from that rediscovery. In the second part of this lecture, I want to turn to very general patterns of arable land use to consider how we can frame these changes in agrobiodiversity in land use terms. And part of my aim here is to address a question that may have occurred to some of you, and that is, if these lost or potential crops are so great, why did they become lost to begin with? Well, improvements in the recovery of ancient human DNA from skeletal remains has clarified how farming dispersed into Europe, what the agency involved was. And the resounding answer is that it was a series of movements of human populations, ultimately of West Asian origin, who then intermingled with local hunter-gatherer groups. And we see that genetically as well. In this complex process, an obvious reason for the loss of crops is that the spread of farming was a series of demographic starts and stops, with ample scope for loss of agrobiodiversity through chance founder effects, combined with the wider range of climate zones that were encountered by these early farmers beyond Western Asia. And in fact, the major losses in terms of agrobiodiversity, if you consider the big picture of the spread of farming across Europe, are the pulses. So pea and lentil makes it all the way to Central Europe, but things like bittervetch, grass pea, other Mediterranean pulses, chickpea, have fallen out of the package by that point. That is the farming package. And in fact, by the time farming makes it to Britain and Ireland, there are apparently no pulse crops at all. Now, going back to Triticum timopheevii, the lost wheat that I mentioned earlier of Central Anatolian origin, it seems, Triticum timopheevii did survive a series of potential bottlenecks to accompany emmer and einkorn wheats, that is other hulled forms of wheat, on their journey as far as Central Europe and Western Europe. And in those regions, it can be traced through the subsequent Neolithic and Bronze Age, so over millennia. But before we leave this picture and this overview of the Neolithic of Europe, I wanted to mention that this practice of recruiting potential food plants from the weed flora was ongoing as farming spread across the European continent as well. So other arable weeds were also recruited into the food system, including actually, again, members of the Brassicaceae, and Descarania sophia sometimes makes an appearance, but also this particular species, which is a Eurasian relative of quinoa. I mean, it's the same genus, Chenopodium album, incredibly common annual plant. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with goosefoot or fat hen or lamb's quarters, as it's variously known. But this is recruited because it helped to broaden the narrowing crop spectrum as farming moved beyond its Mediterranean sort of heartland. Now, I'm going to change gear a bit and start to think about what we can do with arable weeds, that is ancient weed flora, that is species that are accompanying the growth of crops in crop fields, the wildflowers and so on, for the evidence that they can give us about patterns of arable land use. So it turns out that archaeobotanical assemblages tell us not only about ancient crops, they also give us samples of the weed flora that were growing with those crops. And they give us detailed ecological information on the nature of the growing environment. So what I'd like to do at this point of the lecture is to introduce another kind of methodological strand that we use in bioarchaeology, and especially on the botanical side of archaeobotany. And I wanted to include this because I think it will be familiar to the work of others in the biodiversity sort of network community here, and that is plant functional ecology. So in order to reconstruct early crop growing conditions, one of the methods we've developed is to survey the weeds of present day crop fields and then to record their weed flora. And these are crop fields of traditional, what you would broadly call traditional systems, of course, organic systems where herbicides and chemical fertilizers aren't being used. And this is particularly pertaining to the production of cereals and pulses. So the seed crops that are of particular archaeobotanical interest because we see them in charred or carbonized form. And here what we're doing, let me explain what's going on this slide. We are using weed functional traits, things that again may be familiar to some of you, like specific leaf area, the ratio of leaf area to leaf dry weight, canopy dimensions, other leaf traits. And what we're doing is we're using those traits to separate different agricultural regimes, and our statistical approach is linear discriminant analysis. So what you're seeing in the upper diagram is a separation of what I've termed high input systems, those are shown in black, from low input systems. And the inputs here are things like manure and also labor in the form of hand weeding during the crop growing season. And you can get, I'm hoping, a little bit of an impression of what we call a high or a low input system from the little thumbnail photographs you can see in the upper right and upper left-hand corner. So the upper right is actually a set of tiny fields of spelt wheat as still currently grown in the mountainous region of Asturias in northern Spain. And I think you can see in this photograph, those tiny fields are interspersed with vegetables. So they're grown very much in a garden type of system. So that's what I'm referring to here as high input. In the upper left-hand corner, what you're seeing is a large-scale field of, this is actually einkorn wheat. This is in the region of Haute-Provence. So the sort of higher elevation sub-Mediterranean part of Provence, where einkorn is grown as a special protected crop and a kind of regional product, and it's grown organically. Now, what's creating that separation of those two systems is a set of weed functional traits. So each of these symbols that you can see in the black and white part of the diagram at the top represents a different field that we did surveys of. So we've done about 60 high input fields and about 60 actually low input fields. We've then measured the functional traits of all of the weeds that occurred in those fields. And we've used a set of functional traits relating primarily to soil fertility and to a lesser extent soil disturbance to separate the groups. Okay, so the kinds of weeds that we find in high input fields are things, I've put some familiar species in here, you may even recognize them. This is chickweed, Stellaria media. And in the lower right, this is Chenopodium hybridum, so another Chenopodium species. Those would be typical of high input garden-like systems, high fertility, high disturbance. Whereas the weeds that are typical of low input fields would be small, slow growing, thick leaved, stress tolerant species. And I've given you the example here of Ajuga chemophytis, which some of you may know, it's a Mediterranean annual. So that separation gives us a model that we can use archaeobotanically, because what we can do is we can identify the weeds that we find in an archaeobotanical deposit, archaeological deposit, and we can enter those samples then as unknown cases in a model like this to distinguish whether we're looking at a high or a low input system. And so I'm going to give you an example of that application in a moment. And what I'd actually like to do is share with you here some soon to be published work on how cereal growing conditions changed over thousands of years in the Rhineland region west of Cologne. And we chose this region because it has a unique long-term archaeological and archaeobotanical data set due to decades of rescue archaeology in conjunction with open cast lignite mining. And that's what you can see in this kind of landscape picture in the upper right-hand corner here. The map on the left is showing the range of sites from the Neolithic to the Roman period and even later that we included in this analysis. And so these are the results of that analysis. So you're looking at the same discriminant function in each of these cases. So with high input systems on the right and low input systems on the left. And those are now abbreviated as a single large black symbol and a single large white symbol, but those were the modern fields that we originally surveyed. And then all of these gray symbols of different shapes and sizes represent archaeobotanical samples from different periods. So the upper example is showing you Neolithic farming, actually. So these are the first centuries of farming in the Rhineland. The middle diagram, where I've put in this red arrow that I'll explain in a moment, is showing you the situation by the time we get to what's called the late Iron Age. So this is just prior to the Roman period in the first millennium BC. And then at the bottom, we're looking at what's happening in the Roman period, specifically at military and civilian sites that were supplied through quite complex serial production systems. And so, I mean, the general trend through time is from quite a diverse, but at least sometimes quite high input garden-like set of cultivation conditions, and towards ever more low input conditions as we move through time. So in other words, cereals are being grown with lower and lower fertility and lower disturbance as we move through prehistory and into the Roman period. And this trend reaches a particular extreme in the cereal supply systems that we can see in the Roman sites at the bottom. So these results I'm showing you because they show a general agroecological trend from relatively high to low input land management and from small to large scale agricultural systems. And these expansive low input systems that we see in late prehistory and into the Roman period are also picked up in other data sets. And I'm abbreviating quite a lot of evidence here, but those other data sets, for example, would include pollen records that show long-term deforestation and the maintenance of ever more open landscapes. It's in the context of these expansive systems that, going back to Triticum timopheevii for a moment, that the wheat that we tracked from Anatolia, it finally disappears in Western Europe in the first millennium BC. So I'm showing you here some papers that report some of its latest sightings, its latest occurrences. And the ultimate disappearance of Triticum timopheevii is connected with a long-term decline of similar hulled wheats, things like einkorn and emmer, and the rise of hexaploid spelt and bread wheat alongside rye, oats, and barley. And that set of crops really becomes the staples of the medieval period. And in the very final part of my lecture now, I'd like to talk a bit about medieval developments and also about some topics that relate closer to where we are here in Oxford. So the long-term trend towards expansive low input farming connects us with subsequent medieval developments in arable land use, including in the Upper Thames Valley and the vicinity of the city of Oxford. And I imagine that many members of the audience will have seen the medieval ridge and furrow fields along Port Meadow, which is what I'm showing here, or perhaps you've seen the relict medieval field systems that extend along the Charwell floodplain on the other side of town to the east. Well, these ridges and furrows were sculpted by a key technology of the early medieval period known as the moldboard plow, a plow that not only cuts a furrow, but turns the soil over, creating those ridges. And in a current European Research Council project that is led by my colleague, Professor Helena Hamerow in the School of Archaeology, we are investigating the bioarchaeology of the so-called early medieval agricultural revolution, which resulted in the rise of the open field system, of which the moldboard plow was the linchpin. And in this project, we've often talked about what you could refer to as a moldboard plow package that has three key elements. And I'm going to summarize these components now. So the moldboard plow enabled farming of heavy clay soils across a broad swathe of England, but promoted also a coordinated community approach to farming in which crops were rotated systematically in a classic three-course system. So from a winter cereal, often to a spring cereal, followed by a plowed fallow year. And the component I'll focus on here in the brief time that I have remaining in the lecture is what's referred to as serialization. And we've used that term to mean the expansion of cereal farming across the landscape. So essentially the same phenomenon in essence of expansive low input farming that we've seen gradually emerging in the Rhineland example that I just showed you. Now, this is just showing some of the national data that we've been looking at, some of the archaeological case studies that we've been considering in the Feeding Anglo-Saxon England project, which we abbreviate as FeedSax, so I'll refer to it as that. And you can see how we've divided up different regions. And Oxford, which is in this cluster here, there's a very dense cluster of archaeological sites in the city. So in fact, it's in where I'm gesturing to now. But Oxford then falls within this central zone. And it's this central zone that famously in the late medieval period and in the post-medieval period was the heartland of open field farming. And so I'd like to go back to this discriminant function that I've showed you before that is based on weed functional traits to assess especially how fertility changes through time throughout the whole period that is considered by FeedSax. So going from around 500 AD to the end of the 14th century, around 1400. And this scatter plot shows the dates of archaeobotanical samples. So that's the dates shown along the y-axis. And those are samples that contain the remains of crops in carbonized form and the associated remains of weeds for which we can then assess the functional traits. And the y-axis is showing you the same discriminant function that I extracted previously in that contrast of high input and low input systems. And I've just stuck a big arrow in here to remind you that it's in this direction that fertility is declining. Now, the data have gaps and clumps that we can't do much about, right? So there's a bit of a gap here, which is part of what we refer to as the Dark Ages, and there's a reason why it's called that. So we can't do much about the gappiness of the data, but the trend over time is for conditions, if anything, to become not more fertile, but less fertile. And this appears to be an incremental development over nearly 1,000 years. In a wider sense, this was a process that had been going on since the Neolithic, as we've seen in the Rhineland case study. So in that sense, the open field development is part of what I would consider to be a longue durée story that extends from the very beginnings, or in this part of the world, the very arrival of farming. By the 14th century, growing conditions were remarkably low fertility, as we can see in the low scores of the samples between 1300 and 1400 AD. Now, part of the eventual reaction to this long-term development was the promotion of new crops, root crops, lay crops, new crop rotation schemes, and also manuring. And we often associate this with the so-called 18th century agricultural revolution. But what about biodiversity? What is happening with biodiversity through this process? Well, in those terms, medieval crop rotation, in a sense, maintained a certain spectrum of cereals, right? Winter and spring cereals being rotated. But in fact, in the southern part of the central zone, including Oxford, there was an increasing focus through time on bread wheat, on Triticum aestivum, which of course is an ongoing focus of cultivation in Western Europe and indeed globally today. So though you would have thought a certain measure of crop diversity was baked into the three-field rotation system, in fact, what we see by the latest period that's considered by FeedSax is that there is a lot of focus on wheat as the primary form of surplus that is being produced and being fed down the Thames Valley. So I'm actually reaching my conclusion here. I didn't want to overrun, so perhaps I've underrun as a result, but I'd like to finish with a couple of concluding points. The first is that agrobiodiversity loss has occurred over a very long time period, and these historic and even prehistoric patterns of land use, as revealed through bioarchaeology, need to be taken into account to understand the causal background and context of these losses, and of course, for us to think about how to reverse those trends. Equally, bioarchaeological work can reveal startling possibilities and surprises for lost or marginalized crops and food plants that literally in some cases fell by the wayside, that were just forgotten and kind of written off as arable weeds. And some of the examples I've pulled out here, I hope give you a sense of that, but I can assure you that they are only the tip of the iceberg. We have lots of evidence for people using plants that are not recognized in any way as staples around the world today. And I'd like to thank the FeedSax team because I've been borrowing liberally from the thoughts of these individuals. That's Helena Hamerow shown on the upper left-hand corner, who's the PI. Mark McCracker is lower left, and it was his work on wheat that I was just referring to. I also just wanted to share with the Biodiversity Network, while I have your attention, that there's a lot of really interesting early career work in this area concerning not only plants, but also livestock. So also the animal side of biodiversity, including also pollen and more woodland oriented topics within the school at the moment. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Amy. That's terrific. Really, really fascinating. Do you want to stop sharing your screen? And we can feel free to switch on your cameras. It's nice to see some faces in the audience as well. And we can open up to questions. So as I noticed there's one in the chat. Feel free to pop more in the chat or just raise your hand if you want as well, and I might invite you to ask directly. I'll just kick off. I really appreciate that long-term perspective on diversity and then moving down to the local aspect. And the one point, if I understood correctly, that you made was that a lot of the loss of biodiversity was through serendipity, just to founder events or chance events. Initially, I would have thought that maybe climate was a big factor, that just once you moved into wet Western Europe, many of these Mediterranean plants simply couldn't thrive and only a few made it through. And so how do you distinguish between the relative importance of climate versus serendipity and the decline of diversity?
Thanks so much. No, that's a great question. And there's been some recent work that immediately comes to my mind in contrasting those two, as you say, serendipity versus climate. And that is comparing what happens with the Neolithic farming spectrum as it moves up into Central Europe, where it is encountering, as you say, radically different climate constraints, as opposed to what happens as farming spreads across the Mediterranean, where the conditions are similar. And interestingly, along both routes, you get loss of crops. So there is serendipity, but the loss is greater in the case of Central Europe. So you can see the additive effect of climate on top of those chance effects. And this enthusiasm then for recruiting other kind of ruderal plants into the food system that you see in Central Europe seems to be fueled by that loss.
Thank you. Keith, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm coming from a woodland background, so I was intrigued that you'd got acorns as one of your food crops in an early slide, and I wondered how widespread was that?
It's pretty widespread. In fact, just earlier this afternoon, I was coming from the lab where I was looking with colleagues at Plant Material. This is from the Southeast European Neolithic. We get a lot of acorn. And in other parts of the world, it's also known as a food crop. So that problem of tannins that would have to be leached out is clearly something they're willing to reckon with. So it's quite an intensive processing sequence so that they are edible.
Yeah, intriguing.
So you're right, we do need to think not only of these herbaceous ground crops where my bias definitely was, which is pretty obvious today, and to think about the trees and including forms of arboriculture as we move through the sequence as well. And there could definitely be a talk that would merit that focus.
Thank you.
Great. DB, you have a question in the chat. Would you like to ask that directly, or should I read that out? I can read it out then. Is there any information available about how those societies identified edible plants amongst all the non-edibles? Did they have a systematic procedure for trying raw, cooked, soaked, etc., and for which segments of the population?
That's an excellent question. I feel like we do have, I mean, that's a very context-specific answer, but for some of the case studies or sites that I was looking at early on in my lecture, where we can see the emergence of these co-residential household units that are living, within their four walls and storing food and cooking in those spaces. Those would appear to be the experimental groups that are trying different things out. And what's kind of useful to us about this panarchy concept is that it's not a hierarchical system. It's not that anyone needs to be standing over people telling them to experiment with things. They're just doing that. And there will be successes, there will be failures, there will be digestive problems, no doubt, as people are trying different combinations. But the negative effects of that, one would imagine, are being contained within those co-residential groups, whereas the success stories of, hey, I can eat this, this is useful, this is going to plug a gap for us, are being shared.
Okay, thank you. More questions? Yes, so there's one. Adam?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. It's really exciting to see all that put together and to see that record assembled like that. I kind of have two questions. I'll start with one. Is there a correspondence between the archaeological agrobiodiversity that you pick up and the historical record for any of those periods, especially in the medieval periods, when presumably someone's writing about what they're growing? How closely are the two records related to one another?
Yes, and I'm not sure he's in the audience with us, but one of the real experts that I've learned from on this is Dr. Mark McCracker, who's in our department. And what Mark has found is that I'm not a medievalist, so he's going to have to forgive me for what I'm about to say, but there is a textual emphasis on wheat that is a little bit surprising when you see the archaeobotanical evidence, in the sense that, we see a much more diverse crop spectrum. But hence the usefulness of seeing what Mark has teased out of the archaeobotanical record that I was showing in that kind of heat map towards the end, which is that actually in the long run, wheat does become the surplus crop of choice, particularly in this part, not just Oxfordshire, but the southern part of this central zone. And he emphasizes also Oxford's position on the Thames and its ability to send that material around and to feed kind of a particular urban appetite for bread wheat.
So I guess to follow up, so is the wheat then maybe what's moving as surplus more, and then you still have the agrodiversity and sort of the more subsistency, I don't know if that's the wrong word, but the more domestic level
That's right. So I think what you and I would recognize archaeologically is we often get that, right? That we get a kind of domestic subsistence level of agriculture that is quite agrobiodiverse and is actually keeping the whole thing ticking over. And then we see what is marketable or what is of interest to elites or, whatever those forces might be that is promoting certain crops almost to the point of monoculture, depending on the context.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Keith.
Yeah, if I can come back again. I suppose one thing is that presumably the elites would be more likely to write about things, and therefore we get a bias perhaps that way. But I was interested, I wanted to tackle another possible sort of source of uncertainty is how good, I mean, how common is it for these weeds to get preserved? And are there some circumstances where which might be biasing our picture of what is growing because of the way these things are preserved?
No, you're right, and we worry about that a lot. we spend a lot of time, excavating and sampling sites that don't give us much evidence, that just don't have good organic preservation at all. So some of the sites that I was emphasizing, I'm thinking now of the Western Asian part of my talk, sort of towards the beginning. I think I mentioned that they are settlement mounds, so they have really deep stratigraphy, and that is great for preservation. So where we tend to get into preservational problems that were actually much more marked for the medieval period in England than they were for the Neolithic period in Western Asia is just the shallowness of the archaeological deposits being affected then by seasonal wetting and drying and busting up this nice charred, seed evidence that we rely on. But in terms of a bias, no, I mean, there is an inherent bias towards what people are, the plant parts and the plant types that people are messing about with in their houses and that are therefore prone to getting charred. But that in a sense is a bias in our favor if what we're interested in is food plants, but there are always biases and filters at work here. You're absolutely right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any more questions? I think you might have picked up on this in one of your previous answers, Amy, but the tendency for the Oxford region in particular to move towards wheat quite strongly, was that driven by the fact of its location as on a river, as a trading hub?
That is exactly, and in fact, this is an upcoming publication. So there's a conference volume that's coming out of the FeedSax project that Helena Hamerow and Mark McCracker in our department have co-edited, and Mark's paper in that volume, which is coming out later this year with the University of Liverpool Press, is on exactly that issue. So I can make sure he circulates his chapter to us if that's of particular interest. I'm thinking of some of the background to land use history in the local area, but that is exactly his reasoning, yes.
Okay, great. Still time for a few more questions if anybody's got any last thoughts or comments? If not, I'll just say thank you, Amy. And as a plant ecologist, I really appreciated that very novel use of plant functional traits of weeds to look at agricultural history. That was really totally unexpected use of traits there, really enjoyable. But generally, thank you for that sweeping analysis of local history all the way through to the origins of agriculture. That's really good. And I hope this is just the start of interesting conversations that we can have across groups and departments about land use and agrobiodiversity.
We are just so up for that in our department, I have to say. So thank you so much for this chance to share a range of case studies.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to everyone else for attending. So good evening. Thank you.